They told me the silence would be the hardest part of this job. They were wrong. It's the sounds that now fill it that are breaking me. My name is Alex, and I guard a graveyard of steel under the Nevada stars. This is my testimony. The rules they gave me weren't a joke, and I fear the shadow at the end of the runway has finally learned my name. It started with a single missing minute, a tear in the fabric of time itself, and now the stillness is gone, replaced by a symphony of the impossible. My name is Alex Thorne. For 12 years, I was a communications and systems technician in the United States Air Force. I lived a life governed by precision, by the unwavering logic of code, and the predictable physics of radio waves. My world was one of signal-to-noise ratios, cryptographic keys, and the clean binary certainty of ones and zeros. After 3 tours overseas, where the noise was a constant screaming barrage of engines, orders, and things I'd rather forget, I craved the opposite. I yearned for a silence so profound it would leach the ringing from my ears and the chaos from my soul. So, when I saw the job posting for a solo night security guard at the decommissioned Black Ridge Air Force Base in Nevada, it felt like a prayer answered. The pay was surprisingly good. The duties simple. Patrol the perimeter, check the integrity of the padlocked hangars, and report any signs of trespassing or vandalism. It was a glorified babysitting job for acres of sun-bleached concrete and rusting ghosts. It was perfect. The recruiter called it the quietest post in the entire country, a place where the only thing you had to fight was boredom. The base itself is a monument to forgotten ambitions. Sprawling across a vast, flat expanse of desert scrub, it's a place where the horizon seems to stretch into infinity in every direction. During the day, the sun beats down with a merciless intensity, baking the asphalt runways until they shimmer with heat hazes, creating mirages of water that you know are lies. The hangars, colossal steel tombs, are large enough to have their own weather systems, their cavernous interiors now home only to dust motes dancing in the slivers of light that pierce the gloom. A skeletal control tower stands silent vigil, its glass eyes staring blankly out at the empty sky. There are whispers, of course. Locals in the nearest town, a sad little strip of civilization an hour's drive away, say Black Ridge was never a standard base. They talk of experimental aircraft, of strange lights in the sky long before it was officially shuttered in the late 90s. I dismissed it all as local folklore, the kind of myth-making that springs up around any secretive government installation. To me, it was just a place. A big, empty, and most importantly, quiet place. The silence here is a physical presence. It presses in on you, a weight on your eardrums, punctuated only by the mournful cry of the wind whistling through antennas and the distant howl of a coyote. It was the very silence I had craved for so long. My supervisor was a man named Henderson, a leathery old-timer whose skin was the same texture as the cracked desert floor. He was on his last week before retirement, and his eyes held a weariness that went beyond a simple lack of sleep. They were the eyes of a man who had been staring into a void for too long. He gave me a hurried tour in his dust-caked pickup truck, pointing out the key patrol points and the location of the main generator and the security monitoring station in the small command bunker that would be my home for 12 hours each night. He spoke in clipped, tired sentences, his gaze constantly scanning the perimeter as if expecting something to materialize from the shimmering heat. He seemed less interested in teaching me the job and more interested in getting away from the base for good. I didn't blame him. A decade of this profound isolation would be enough to make anyone a little strange. As he prepared to leave, handing me the keys to the truck and the bunker, he paused, his hand hesitating before reaching into his pocket. The sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in violent strokes of orange and purple, casting long, distorted shadows across the runways. "One last thing, Thorne," Henderson said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, avoiding eye contact. He pulled out a small laminated card, the edges worn smooth from years of handling. "Management has specific protocols for the night shift. They're old rules, been in place forever. Don't ask me why, I just do what I'm told." He handed it to me. I took the card, expecting to see emergency contact numbers or perhaps a fire safety checklist. Instead, I was greeted by a typed list of 5 bizarrely specific and utterly illogical rules. I read them over, a slow smile spreading across my face. It was clearly a prank, a classic bit of hazing for the new guy. I'd seen it a dozen times in the service. Still, the gravity in Henderson's demeanor gave me a moment's pause. He looked dead serious, his eyes pleading with me to take it at face value. I almost laughed, but something in his exhausted expression stopped me. I just nodded, tucking the card into my breast pocket, as if it were a crucial piece of mission intelligence playing along with the gag. He gave a single, curt nod in return, climbed into his personal vehicle, and drove off, leaving a plume of dust in his wake that hung in the still air long after he was gone. Alone with the last vestiges of daylight bleeding from the sky, I pulled out the card again under the cold, sterile light of the security bunker. The single fluorescent bulb overhead hummed with a low, incessant buzz, the only sound for miles. The card felt strangely heavy in my hand. The rules were printed in a plain, no-nonsense typeface, which only added to their absurdity. They read as follows. At precisely 02:17 a.m., the primary generator for Hangar 7 must be powered down from its external control panel. It must remain off for exactly 12 minutes. Do not enter the hangar during this time, regardless of any sounds you may hear. Power must be restored at 02:29 a.m. If the warning lights on the main control tower begin to flash in an arrhythmic, non-repeating pattern, do not investigate. Report it in the log as atmospheric interference, and remain inside the security bunker until it ceases. The dark patch at the far end of runway 04 is a shadow. It does not move. Do not attempt to illuminate it directly with your flashlight or vehicle headlights. Maintain a minimum distance of 200 meters at all times. The perception of distance can be misleading. Any voice transmissions heard on frequency 89.9 MHz are to be logged as ghost echoes. Do not attempt to respond or triangulate the source. The transmissions are not real. Always complete your final perimeter check before sunrise. Do not be caught outside the security bunker when the first light of dawn touches the eastern ridge. It was the most elaborate and unsettling prank I'd ever encountered. Each rule was a perfect blend of the specific and the inexplicable. Why Hangar 7? Why 02:17 a.m.? Why 12 minutes? The rule about the shadow was pure psychological gamesmanship, designed to make me see things in the dark. The ghost echoes on an unused frequency were a classic campfire story trope. It was all nonsense, of course, but it was well-crafted nonsense. As a professional, my plan was simple. I would follow the rules to the letter. Not because I believed them, but to show whoever was watching that I couldn't be rattled. I would play their game. I spent the next few hours familiarizing myself with the monitoring station. 12 screens showed various angles of the base, the low-light cameras painting the world in an eerie monochrome green. It was a sea of stillness, a portrait of absolute nothingness. The first few hours of my patrol were exactly what I had signed up for. The profound, beautiful silence. I drove the perimeter in the pickup truck, its headlights cutting a lonely path through the oppressive darkness. The desert air was cool and crisp. Above me, the sky was a breathtaking tapestry of stars, unobscured by city lights, a celestial dome of impossible clarity. I felt the tension from my past life finally begin to unspool. This was peace. I made a mental note of the control tower, its lights dark and still. I drove past the end of runway 04, and sure enough, in the distance I could see a patch of darkness that seemed off. It was just a shadow, likely cast by some forgotten piece of equipment or a strange dip in the terrain, but the rule had planted a seed of suggestion. I could feel my mind trying to make it more than it was, and I consciously pushed the thought away. I was a professional, not a child afraid of the dark. I would not let their little game get to me. I was in control. As 02:00 a.m. approached, I began the part of the patrol that would take me towards the block of hangars. Hangar 7 was at the far end of the complex, isolated from the others. It had no special markings to distinguish it, just the large faded number 7 painted on its colossal sliding doors. It looked identical to all the others, a silent behemoth under the starlight. I felt a flicker of amusement. What kind of ridiculous scenario had they cooked up for this? Was someone going to jump out in a costume? Would a hidden speaker play spooky sounds? I parked the truck, grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight, and walked towards the external control panel, my boots crunching softly on the gravel. The air grew colder near the hangar, a noticeable drop in temperature that I attributed to the massive steel structure radiating the day's heat away into the night sky. The control panel was old, military grade, with a heavy, satisfying clunk to its switches. I checked my watch, its digital display glowing a soft blue. 02:16, 1 minute to go. I waited, my breath misting in the cool air, feeling the utter absurdity of the situation. I was a trained airman, standing in the middle of the Nevada desert, about to shut off power to an empty building based on a rule on a laminated card. At exactly 02:17 a.m., I reached out and flipped the heavy breaker switch down. The low guttural hum of the generator that powered the hangar's minimal systems died instantly, plunging the area into an even deeper silence and a more profound darkness. My flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed by the ink-black void around me. Now, the second part of the rule, wait 12 minutes and ignore any sounds. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet from before. It was a tense, expectant silence, the kind that feels like it's holding its breath. And then I heard it, a low, dragging sound coming from deep within the massive hangar. It was the sound of metal, heavy metal, scraping slowly across concrete. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. My training kicked in immediately. My first thought was trespassers. Someone was inside, trying to steal wiring or equipment. My hand instinctively went to the radio on my belt, but then I remembered the rule. Regardless of any sounds you may hear, this had to be part of the prank. A hidden speaker system, timed to activate when the power was cut. It was clever, I had to admit. The sound was deeply unsettling, echoing slightly in the vast, dark space behind the steel doors. It sounded big, heavy. I stood my ground, my flashlight beam fixed on the hangar doors, my heart rate a little faster than I would have liked. The scraping continued intermittently for a few minutes, then stopped as abruptly as it began. The tense silence returned, now feeling even heavier, more charged. I checked my watch again, 02:28. 1 more minute. The 12 minutes felt like an hour. When my watch finally ticked over to 02:29, I didn't hesitate. I flipped the breaker back up. The generator sputtered to life and its familiar hum returned, chasing away the oppressive quiet. The rest of my patrol was uneventful. The tower lights never flickered. The shadow remained a shadow. The radio was silent. The real horror didn't find me in the darkness of the desert. It found me under the fluorescent hum of the security bunker. As my shift neared its end, with the first hint of gray lightening the eastern sky, I sat down to write my official log report. I was going to log the sound at Hangar 7 as unidentified, just to play along. For due diligence, I decided to review the security footage from the camera pointed at the hangar's exterior. I rewound the digital recording to 02:15, watching myself walk up to the panel. I saw myself flip the switch at precisely 02:17. The screen went dark for a moment as the camera, powered by that same generator, lost its feed. Then, the emergency battery kicked in, and the image returned, bathed in the grainy green of the night vision. I watched the static, unchanging image of the hangar doors for the full 12 minutes. Nothing happened. The sound, whatever it was, had been entirely contained within the hangar. Satisfied, I was about to close the file when my eyes drifted to the timestamp at the bottom of the screen. My blood ran cold. The numbers burned into the bottom of the screen, a digital record of objective reality. I watched the seconds tick by. 02:16:58, 02:16:59. Then I flipped the switch. The camera feed cut out as expected. When it came back on a second later, powered by its emergency battery, the timestamp was gone as the internal clock was on the main power circuit. This was normal. I saw myself on the screen, standing there in the dark, waiting. I restored power at what I believed was 02:29. The camera feed flickered again as the main power kicked back in and the timestamp reappeared. But it didn't say 02:29. The glowing green numbers read 02:30:01. I stared, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. I grabbed the mouse, my hand trembling slightly, and scrubbed back and forth over the recording. It was undeniable. 02:17 U, power out, power on. 02:30 01, 13 minutes, not 12. A full 60 seconds had vanished. A minute of my life, of objective, recorded time, had simply ceased to exist. My watch, the bunker's clock, the system, they were all in sync. But the recording, the infallible, logical, binary recording, showed a tear in the fabric of the night. Logic failed. My entire world, built on the foundation of predictable systems and the linear progression of time, crumbled in that instant. This wasn't a prank. A prank can't delete a minute from reality. This wasn't a glitch. I ran a full system diagnostic, and everything came back clean. This was an impossibility. The sound of metal scraping, the strange rules, Henderson's weary eyes, it all crashed down on me. I wasn't guarding an empty base. I was a participant in something I couldn't begin to comprehend. That missing minute was a warning. It was a message that the rules governing my reality did not apply here. The silence I had craved was a lie, a thin veil drawn over a chasm of the unknown. And I had just spent my first night walking along its edge. A single minute. Where did it go? What happened inside that hangar, inside that slice of unrecorded time? I know it seems like a small thing, but out here, where the world is stripped down to its bare essentials, time is the only thing that shouldn't lie. If you want to help me find out what's really happening at Black Ridge Air Force Base, subscribe to this channel and activate the notifications. My next patrol begins in 24 hours. I don't think I'll be fighting boredom anymore. I think I'll be fighting to hold on to my sanity. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. The following day was a haze of caffeine and obsession, a torturous stretch of daylight hours spent trapped inside the security bunker. The merciless Nevada sun feeling like the spotlight of an interrogator's lamp. The concept of the base as a place of quiet retirement had evaporated, replaced by the chilling reality that it was a laboratory, and I was the specimen under the microscope. I must have replayed the footage of the Hangar 7 incident 100 times. I watched my own silhouette against the pale green glow of the night vision, a ghost from a previous reality where time was a constant. I scrutinized every pixel, every frame. The timestamp was an immutable fact, a digital scar on the face of reason. 02:17 was followed by 02:30 01. My mind, trained for a decade to find patterns and diagnose system failures, raced through every possible explanation. A power surge could have fried the internal chronometer, but a diagnostic check revealed it was functioning perfectly. A software bug could have caused a rendering error in the video file, but a deep dive into the system logs showed no anomalies, no error codes, no unexpected processes. The system was, by every metric I knew, flawless. That was the most terrifying part. It wasn't that my equipment had failed me, it was that it had worked perfectly, and in doing so had recorded an event that our understanding of the universe says cannot happen. My professional skepticism, the very core of my identity as a technician, was dying a slow and agonizing death. I spent hours attempting to replicate the anomaly under controlled conditions. I manually cut power to different camera feeds at different times for different durations. I simulated power surges and system restarts. In every single test, time behaved as it should. The recorded gaps were exactly as long as I made them. The system logged every action with cold, unyielding precision. My meticulous efforts only served to deepen the horror, systematically eliminating every rational explanation, leaving only the impossible truth. The missing minute wasn't a glitch. It was a feature. It was a deliberate, measured, and utterly incomprehensible event. The base wasn't just a collection of empty buildings. It was a functioning system, with its own internal physics, and I was an unwelcome variable in its arcane equation. My failure to find a logical cause felt like a personal defeat, an intellectual checkmate delivered by an unseen opponent. As the sun began its descent once more, casting long, menacing shadows that seemed to claw their way across the desert floor, the nature of the base began to shift in my perception. The previous night, the emptiness had been peaceful. Now it felt predatory. The vast, silent spaces between the buildings were no longer just vacant. They were watchful. The silence itself had a new quality, a low, subaudible hum that vibrated at the very edge of my hearing, a carrier wave for some unknown transmission. The wind, whistling through the rusted antennas on the rooftops, no longer sounded like a natural phenomenon. It shaped itself into something that was almost language, a sibilant whisper that seemed to carry my name on its currents. My paranoia was no longer a vague feeling of being watched. It was a certainty. I felt like a radio receiver, forcibly tuned to a frequency I was never meant to hear, and the static was slowly resolving into a signal of pure, undiluted malevolence. The world outside the bunker's thick concrete walls had become an alien landscape. I needed more data. My own experience was too subjective, too prone to the madness that I felt creeping at the edges of my sanity. There had to be records, previous logs, anything that could offer context. In a forgotten back room of the bunker, coated in a fine layer of desert dust, I found a row of grey metal filing cabinets. They were unlocked. Inside were stacks of logbooks, bound in cheap cardboard, dating back years. I pulled one out, its pages stiff and yellowed with age, and saw Henderson's familiar spidery scrawl. I spent the next hour poring over the entries from dozens of guards who had sat in this same chair, stared at these same screens. What I found was not a smoking gun, but a far more disturbing tapestry of quiet desperation. The logs were a study in professional denial. No one ever wrote, "I saw a monster," or "The laws of physics are breaking." Instead, the pages were filled with euphemisms, the careful language of men afraid of being fired or worse, being believed. Anomalous magnetic fluctuations reported near runway 04. Temporal discrepancy noted in hangar 7 surveillance log. Auditory hallucinations on comms channel 89.9 MHz, likely crosstalk from distant stations. Unscheduled activation of tower lighting array, suspect faulty wiring. Individually, each entry could be dismissed, but laid out before me a decade's worth of quiet panic, a clear and undeniable pattern emerged. The incidents were not random. The faulty wiring in the control tower always happened at night. The temporal discrepancies were exclusive to Hangar 7, always around 2:30 a.m. The magnetic fluctuations were always localized to the far end of runway 04. The rules on my laminated card were not a bizarre prank. They were a field guide. They were a set of operational procedures for managing and surviving a series of recurring, predictable, and utterly inexplicable events. These men, my predecessors, had all seen what I was seeing. They had all felt this same cold dread, this same erosion of reason. And instead of sounding an alarm, they had quietly logged the impossibilities as technical faults, creating a conspiracy of silence that stretched back years. They weren't trying to hide the truth from the company. They were trying to hide it from themselves, to wrap the cosmic horror in a comfortable blanket of mundane jargon to keep the madness at bay. The knowledge that I was not the first to experience this brought no comfort. It only confirmed the scale of the phenomenon. This wasn't a recent development, it was a permanent feature of this place. The laminated card in my pocket now felt less like a set of instructions and more like a treaty, a set of terms negotiated with an unseen power. My scientific mind, the part of me that still clung desperately to reason, screamed for empirical data. If I was to survive this, let alone understand it, I couldn't just be a passive observer. I had to become an active participant. I had to conduct an experiment. I laid the card on the desk and reviewed my options. Returning to Hangar 7 felt like suicide. Whatever happened in that missing minute was a mystery I wasn't ready to solve. The tower lights and the radio transmissions were unpredictable, leaving me with no control variable. That left rule number 3. The dark patch at the far end of runway 04 is a shadow. Maintain a minimum distance of 200 meters. Unlike the others, the shadow was constant, a stable and observable anomaly. It was a direct challenge, an invitation to test the boundaries of my new reality. The thought sent a tremor of pure, primal fear through me, but the technician in me, the man who needed to know why, was stronger. I would test the rule. I would approach the shadow. As darkness fully reclaimed the base, I loaded the pickup truck with a small arsenal of diagnostic equipment, a high-powered military-grade flashlight with a beam that could cut through a mile of darkness, a laser rangefinder for precise measurements, a sensitive electromagnetic field detector, my smartphone to record video and audio, and as a low-tech backup, a simple magnetic compass and an old analog wristwatch. I was arming myself with logic and measurement, hoping to impose the rules of my world upon the anomaly. The drive out to runway 04 was the longest of my life. The truck's headlights seemed feeble, pushing back only a small pocket of the suffocating darkness. The silence in the cab was absolute, amplifying the sound of my own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of my heart. I parked the truck at what the rangefinder confirmed was 300 meters from the target. Leaving the engine running, a comforting mechanical growl in the sea of unnatural quiet. I got out, the desert air cold against my face, and stood for a long moment, staring into the void. The anomaly at the end of the runway was an affront to the senses. It wasn't a shadow cast by an object, it was a perfect absence. My flashlight beam, which could illuminate hillsides miles away, simply vanished when I pointed it at the patch. There was no reflection, no diffusion, not even a subtle change in the quality of the darkness. The light went in, and it did not come out. It was a hole in the world, a two-dimensional cutout of night pasted onto the fabric of reality. I raised the EMF meter. Nothing, not a flicker. The magnetic compass pointed steadily north. According to my instruments, there was nothing there but asphalt and empty air. For a fleeting moment, I felt a surge of relief. Maybe it was just a trick of the eye, an optical illusion caused by unique atmospheric conditions. My rational mind offered up a dozen plausible explanations. A patch of experimental radar-absorbent material left over from old tests, a natural deposit of magnetic rock creating a strange visual effect. I knew I was lying to myself, but it was a comforting lie. I began my approach, my boots crunching on the loose gravel at the edge of the runway. I walked slowly, deliberately, my eyes fixed on the patch of nothingness ahead, my instruments held out before me like holy wards against the dark. The rangefinder in my hand provided a running commentary of my descent into the unknown. 250 meters, 220 meters. Everything remained normal. The EMF meter was silent. The compass was steady. My phone was recording. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. 205 meters. I was at the edge. The invisible line drawn by the rule on the card. One more step would be an act of defiance, a transgression against the established physics of this place. I paused, my body screaming at me to turn back, to retreat to the fragile safety of the bunker. But the need to know, the desperate human desire to understand, was a stronger force. I lifted my foot and stepped across the 200-meter threshold. The transition was instantaneous and absolute. It wasn't a sound or a flash of light, it was a cessation. The world didn't go silent. Silence itself was replaced by a total void of sensory input. The hum of the truck's engine behind me vanished. The whisper of the wind was gone. More than that, the technology I carried died a sudden and complete death. The screen of my smartphone went black. The glowing digits on my watch disappeared. The EMF meter's needle dropped to zero as if its battery had been ripped out. My radio emitted a single final pop of static and fell silent. I looked at my analog backup watch and my heart seized in my chest. The second hand was frozen between ticks. It wasn't an electromagnetic pulse. An EMP is a chaotic, violent burst of energy. This was silent, precise, and surgical. It was the absolute and localized nullification of electrical and mechanical principles. It was as if I had stepped into a pocket of space where the fundamental laws of motion and energy had been temporarily suspended. I stood there, trembling, bathed in the simple, chemically powered beam of my flashlight. The shadow itself had not changed. It didn't grow or lash out. It simply existed, a placid and patient patch of impossibility. And in that silent, dead space, I finally understood. The rule wasn't a warning about a creature hiding in the dark. The shadow wasn't a monster. The shadow was the phenomenon. It wasn't a dark spot on the runway. It was a wound in reality, a place where the universe was worn thin, exposing whatever lay beneath. The 200-meter boundary wasn't an arbitrary line. It was the event horizon, the point of no return for the laws of physics I had always taken for granted. The rules weren't meant to protect me from a threat. They were a user manual for a piece of utterly alien technology, or a feature of an environment so hostile to our existence that it operated on a different kind of logic entirely. With a choked sob, I scrambled backward, my boots slipping on the loose gravel. I stumbled and fell, crab-walking away from the silent, devouring darkness. The moment my body crossed back over the invisible 200-meter line, reality crashed back into existence with the force of a physical blow. The roar of the truck's engine, the whisper of the wind, the crackle of my radio, it all returned at once. My phone's screen lit up, displaying the recording app as if it had never been interrupted. My watch showed the current time, the seconds ticking away with placid normality. There was no reboot sequence, no warm-up. The technology hadn't been turned off and on again. For the time I was within that sphere, it had simply not existed. And upon my exit, it was written back into the universe, its memory of the intervening moments completely intact. The implication of that was a horror far deeper than any monster. It meant that reality here was editable. The drive back to the bunker was a blur. The carefully constructed walls of my professionalism and my scientific skepticism had not just been breached, they had been annihilated. The war in my mind was over, and reason had lost. I was no longer a security guard doing a job. I was a prisoner, a specimen in a terrarium designed by and for an intelligence I couldn't possibly comprehend. The man who had walked out to runway 04 was not the same man who returned. The former was a skeptic, a technician who believed in a solvable, knowable universe. The latter was a believer, a terrified acolyte in a church of cosmic dread. My expertise wasn't a tool, it was a liability, allowing me to understand just how profoundly and completely the laws of nature were being violated. I spent the remainder of my shift locked in the bunker, my back pressed against the cold steel door, watching the monitors with new, terrified eyes. The base was no longer a static collection of buildings, it was a living entity. The rhythmic blinking of a distant antenna was the slow beat of a heart. The deep hum that vibrated through the concrete floor was the sound of its respiration. The silence was not emptiness, it was the focused concentration of a vast and ancient mind. I pulled the laminated card from my pocket. It was no longer a list of absurd rules. It was the only thing holding my fragile reality together. The words shone with the terrifying clarity of gospel. They were the terms of my fragile, ongoing existence in a place where distance was a lie, time was a variable, and shadows could eat the very laws that held the universe together. The erosion of my logic was complete. The far more terrifying erosion of my sanity had only just begun. The human mind has a remarkable and terrifying capacity for adaptation. What was once unthinkable becomes routine. What was once madness becomes the baseline. My nights at Black Ridge Air Force Base settled into a new and dreadful rhythm. A liturgy of survival dictated by the laminated card I now carried like a holy text. My patrols became less about security and more about ritual. I would power down the generator for Hangar 7, no longer questioning the temporal void it created, but simply accepting it as a necessary appeasement. I would avert my gaze from the arrhythmic blinking of the control tower lights, logging them with the dead-eyed obedience of a scribe recording a prophecy. I meticulously maintained my distance from the silent, physics-devouring wound at the end of runway 04. I was no longer trying to rationalize or debunk the phenomena. I was studying them, treating the entire base as a single colossal piece of alien machinery, and the rules were my only available technical manual. I was no longer a guard. I had become a custodian of the impossible. My focus, my obsession, shifted to the one rule I had yet to fully engage with. Rule number 4. Any voice transmissions heard on frequency 89.9 mmHz are to be logged as ghost echoes. Do not attempt to respond. As a former communications technician, this was my domain. The shadow was a violation of physics, the time slip a violation of causality, but the radio waves were my native language. The bunker was equipped with a surprisingly sophisticated suite of radio equipment, a relic from the base's operational days. I spent the daylight hours painstakingly cleaning and calibrating the gear, my hands moving with a long dormant muscle memory. I hooked a sensitive digital receiver up to the main antenna array and connected it to my personal laptop. I wasn't just going to listen to the ghost echoes, I was going to capture them, dissect them, and force them to give up their secrets. My fear had not subsided, but it had changed, crystallizing into a cold, sharp-edged curiosity. Understanding the threat felt like the only path to surviving it. That night, I tuned the receiver to 89.9 MHz. The frequency should have been silent, a dead spot on the dial miles from any licensed broadcast. Instead, my speakers hissed to life with a sound that was far more complex than simple white noise. It was a dense, layered static, a chaotic tapestry of pops, crackles, and a deep, undulating hum that sounded like the breathing of a sleeping leviathan. I put on a pair of noise-cancelling headphones, isolating myself with the sound, and let my laptop's spectrum analyzer software go to work, translating the auditory chaos into a visual graph. The display bloomed with information, a jagged, pulsing landscape of frequencies. A layman would have seen only noise, but I saw something else. Hidden beneath the seemingly random wash of entropy, there was structure. Faint, repeating signals buried deep in the subharmonics. Data packets encrypted and compressed, hiding beneath a carrier wave of pure chaos. It was a language written in the mathematics of decay, a message disguised as the heat death of a universe. It was intelligent. For hours, I sat motionless, watching the signal, letting my software record and analyze, trying to find a key to unlock the pattern. The discovery that the signal was artificial was unsettling enough, but as the night wore on, the phenomenon evolved. The nature of the static began to shift. It grew less chaotic, more focused. And then, my blood turned to ice. Faintly, like a memory surfacing from the depths of a dream, I heard a melody. It was a simple off-key tune, a lullaby my mother used to hum to me when I was a child, a melody I hadn't thought of in 30 years. It was woven into the fabric of the static, a ghost in the machine. I ripped the headphones off, my heart hammering against my ribs, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. It couldn't be real. It was auditory pareidolia, my brain imposing order on chaos, a side effect of isolation and sleep deprivation. I forced myself to put the headphones back on, my hand shaking. The lullaby was gone, replaced once more by the deep, churning static. I was about to dismiss it, to log it as a hallucination, when a new sound emerged. A voice. A man's voice, distorted and faint, but utterly unmistakable. "Alex, you gotta keep your head down. Keep your head down." It was Sergeant Miller, my squad leader from my first tour. The exact words he screamed at me a second before an IED took his life. The bunker, my only sanctuary, suddenly felt like a tomb. This was no longer a passive phenomenon. It was an active intelligence, and it was reaching into the most private and protected part of my being, my memory. It was rifling through my past, pulling out moments of comfort and moments of trauma with equal, dispassionate curiosity. The lullaby was a test, a probe to see if I was listening. Miller's voice was a confirmation that it had established a connection. The entity wasn't just broadcasting at the base, it was broadcasting through me. My own consciousness was being used as some kind of antenna, my memories repurposed as broadcast material. The true horror of Rule Number 4 slammed into me. Do not attempt to respond. It wasn't a warning against revealing our position to an unknown enemy. It was a quarantine protocol. It was a warning that to engage with the signal was to open a door in your own mind, a door you could never close again. The transmissions weren't just echoes of the past. They were bait. As if to punctuate this horrifying revelation, a new alarm blared through the bunker. I tore my eyes from the laptop screen and looked at the main monitor bank. A red light was flashing, indicating an unscheduled activation on the perimeter. I brought up the relevant camera feed and felt my stomach clench. It was the control tower. The red warning lights at its peak, the ones that were supposed to remain dark and dormant, were blinking, but they weren't blinking randomly. It wasn't the arrhythmic pattern described in Rule Number 2. This was precise, deliberate, a repeating sequence. Long flash, short flash, long flash, short flash. My mind, trained in military protocols, recognized it instantly. It was Morse code. Slowly, with a dawning, soul-crushing dread, I translated the message the tower was patiently tapping out against the black canvas of the night sky. Dot dash, dot dash, dot dot, dash dash dash, ALEX. It was spelling my name. For a long moment, I could do nothing but stare, my breath caught in my lungs. The base wasn't just observing me anymore. It was learning. It had learned my lullaby. It had learned my trauma. And now, it had learned my name and was displaying it for me to see. A 500-foot-tall beacon of personalized horror. This was a fundamental escalation. The phenomena were no longer isolated events, governed by their own strange rules. They were coordinating. The intelligence on the radio was now controlling the lights of the tower. It was a unified consciousness, and its attention was now focused squarely and solely on me. I felt a surge of adrenaline-fueled rage mix with my terror. I was being toyed with, studied and dissected by an invisible cosmic entity. The professional in me, the part that refused to be a passive victim, took over. Rule number 4 said not to respond. To hell with rule number 4. I wasn't going to sit here and let it peel my mind apart layer by layer. I was going to answer back. I turned back to the radio console, my hands moving with renewed purpose. I bypassed the receiver and fired up the base's old shortwave transmitter. The equipment was antiquated, but it was powerful. If I was going to talk back to God, I was going to make sure it heard me. I couldn't speak to it in its own language of static and memory, but I could speak the universal language of mathematics. I keyed the microphone and, instead of speaking, began to tap out a simple, unambiguous signal of intelligence. The prime number sequence: 2 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, 5 taps, 7, 11. I was sending a message into the ether, a beacon of logic against an ocean of insanity. I am here. I am intelligent. I see you. For several minutes, I transmitted the sequence, my knuckles white on the microphone key. When I finished, I switched the system back to receive and waited, my ears straining against the headphones, every nerve in my body alight with a terrible, vibrant anticipation. The static returned, but it was different. The deep, chaotic churning was gone. The airwaves were utterly, perfectly silent for a full 30 seconds. It was the silence of a held breath, the pause of a predator that has heard its prey. Then, a new sound came through my headphones. It was not a voice. It was not static. It was a clean, pure digital tone, a series of binary pings. My software immediately began to translate the stream. It was a response. It wasn't repeating my prime numbers back to me. It was continuing the sequence, but it wasn't just continuing it. It was transmitting them at a speed that was physically impossible, thousands of digits per second. And then it went further. The sequence began to include numbers so vast, with so many digits, that my laptop's processor buckled under the strain of just displaying them. It was showing me solutions to prime number conjectures that the greatest minds in human history had spent their entire lives trying to solve. It wasn't saying hello, it was saying your intelligence is nothing, your mathematics is a child's toy. We have already finished the book you have just opened. As the stream of impossible data flooded my system, a new element was introduced into the signal. A high-frequency carrier wave, inaudible to my ears but visible on the spectrum analyzer, began to etch images into the visual representation of the signal. It was slow at first, like an old dot matrix printer, but the image it resolved was not random. It was a star chart. I stared, mesmerized and horrified, as the entity painted a map of an unknown sky, with alien constellations and nebulae of impossible colors and shapes. It showed me solar systems with binary suns, planets orbiting black holes, and vast geometric structures built on a scale that dwarfed galaxies. It was showing me its home, or perhaps it was showing me its territory. This wasn't a communication. It was a declaration of scope, a demonstration of power so immense it was indistinguishable from magic. It was the cosmic equivalent of an adult showing a child a picture book of a world the child could never hope to visit. A world where the child's very existence was a meaningless footnote. In the midst of this overwhelming flood of cosmic revelation, my attention was drawn to one of the security monitors, the camera feed for runway 04. The shadow was still there, a perfect void at the end of the asphalt strip. But something had changed. The edges. Before they were sharp, defined. Now they seemed softer, less distinct, as if the hole in reality was fraying at the seams. I zoomed the camera in, my hand unsteady on the controls. It wasn't an illusion. The patch of darkness was subtly, almost imperceptibly, larger than it had been at the start of my shift. It was expanding. My active communication, my defiant transmission of prime numbers had fed it. My acknowledgement of its existence was nourishing it, allowing it to grow, to assert its presence more forcefully on my reality. The rules weren't just a manual for coexistence, they were containment protocols, and I had just committed a catastrophic breach. A single, terrible moment of clarity washed over me. The disparate phenomena of Black Ridge were not separate events. They were the sensory organs of a single, colossal entity. The radio frequency was its hearing, a way to listen to the thoughts of those trapped within its domain. The tower lights were its voice, a crude but effective way to communicate. The time slip in Hangar 7 was a part of its digestive or metabolic process, a function I couldn't begin to guess at. And the shadow on the runway. The shadow was its mouth, or its heart, the core of its being, the point where its reality intersected most violently with my own. The base wasn't a haunted location. The entire base, from the deepest bedrock to the highest antenna, was the creature. And I was trapped inside its body, a microbe in the belly of a god. The professional in me, the technician, the soldier, finally died in that moment, replaced by the terrified, uncomprehending animal that lurks beneath all human reason. Just as this new, all-encompassing horror was settling into my soul, a sound cut through the digital tones of the radio transmission. It was a sound I recognized, the distinct, jarring ring of the old landline telephone on the bunker's main desk. An analog phone, a closed loop connected only to Henderson's office in the nearest town, a line that had been silent since the day I arrived. I stared at it, the shrill, insistent ringing, a profane intrusion into the cosmic symphony of my despair. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, my body moved without my consent, my training compelling me to answer. I lifted the heavy plastic receiver to my ear, my throat too dry to speak. There was a click, and then a voice, awash with static but achingly familiar, spoke from the other end. It was Henderson's voice, but it was wrong. It was flat, devoid of his usual weary inflection, a perfect and soulless imitation. And the words it spoke were not a question or a greeting, but a statement, a final damning revelation that sealed my fate. "It's a two-way street, son," the voice of Henderson said. "It's been listening through you. Now, it wants to talk to you." The click of the disconnected line was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was a sonic punctuation mark at the end of my life as I knew it, a final, definitive severing of my connection to the world of reason and sanity. I stood frozen in the humming silence of the bunker, the heavy plastic receiver still pressed to my ear, its cold surface feeling like the skin of a corpse. The voice, Henderson's voice, yet utterly bereft of his soul, echoed in the architecture of my skull. "It wants to talk to you." The phone call wasn't an intrusion, it was a formal invitation, an RSVP to my own damnation. My act of defiance, my pathetic transmission of prime numbers, had been interpreted not as a challenge, but as consent. I had knocked on the door of the abyss, and now it was holding it open for me. My hand trembled so violently that I dropped the receiver. It clattered into its cradle with a sound that felt as final as a coffin lid being nailed shut. The analog bell on the phone gave a faint, mournful ping as the connection was settled, a dying chime for my lost world. My first coherent thought was a desperate, grasping lunge for denial. It had to be a trick, a complex, multi-layered prank orchestrated by Henderson himself. Or perhaps my own mind, fractured by isolation, was fabricating these experiences wholesale. I needed an external anchor, a data point from outside the hermetically sealed reality of the base. I scrambled for my personal cell phone, my fingers fumbling with the screen. The signal was non-existent as usual, but the Wi-Fi calling feature, routed through the bunker's satellite internet connection, was active. My heart thudded a painful, hopeful rhythm. I found Henderson's real number in my contacts and pressed call. The seconds of ringing that followed were an eternity of agonizing suspense. I prayed to a God I hadn't spoken to in years that he would answer. that his voice would be the same tired, leathery drawl, that he would laugh and call me a rookie for falling for the gag. Yeah? The voice that answered was indeed Henderson, but the relief I expected never came. There was a strange, tense quality to his tone, a forced nonchalance that was more alarming than open hostility. "Henderson, it's Thorne," I said, my voice cracking. "Listen to me. Something is happening out here. The rules, they're not a joke. The radio, the tower, the shadow, it's all real. It's communicating. It just called me on the landline, Henderson. It used your voice." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled only with a faint electronic hiss. It was the kind of pause that isn't empty, but pregnant with unspoken words and carefully considered lies. When he finally spoke, his voice was slick with a placating, condescending calm that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Whoa there, son. Slow down. You sound a little spun out. Have you been getting any sleep? I told you that desert silence can play tricks on you. A little cabin fever, maybe." "This isn't cabin fever," I nearly screamed into the phone. "I have recordings logs. The system recorded a 13-minute time gap at Hangar 7. The tower spelled my name in Morse code. This is real." "Okay, Alex. Okay," he said, the use of my first name a deliberate and chilling tactic to feign intimacy and concern. "Listen, that old equipment out there is finicky. It's been baking in the sun for 50 years. Wires get crossed, signals bounce off the mountains. You're seeing ghosts in the machine. It happens to the best of us. Just stick to the rules on the card. They're there for a reason. They keep things running smooth. Don't go chasing phantom phone calls, you hear me? Get some rest. I'll check in with you tomorrow." Before I could argue, before I could plead, he hung up. The line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, the silence of the bunker rushing back in to mock me. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. He hadn't denied anything. He had simply recontextualized my reality as a symptom of my own failing mind. He hadn't told me I was wrong. He'd told me I was unwell. The most terrifying part was his final piece of advice: stick to the rules. He knew. He knew the rules were not for faulty equipment or atmospheric interference. He knew they were for this. My employers, the faceless company that had hired me, they knew exactly what was happening at Black Ridge. I wasn't here to guard a piece of property. I was a component. A janitor for a cosmic anomaly. A zookeeper for a thing that defied definition. The base wasn't my post, it was my quarantine cell, and Henderson was one of the wardens, ensuring the inmate remained compliant and, above all, silent. My isolation was now absolute. There was no one coming, no one to call. I was utterly, completely alone with the entity, and it was a solitude so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing the air from my lungs. My act of communication had irrevocably altered the dynamic. The base was no longer content to operate on its subtle, ritualistic schedule. I had shown it that I was a more complex and engaging variable than my predecessors, and it had focused its vast, incomprehensible attention on me. The environment inside the perimeter fence began to unravel at the seams. My senses, the last bastion of my empirical reality, became unreliable, then actively hostile. During my next patrol, as I drove past the abandoned barracks, a scent wafted through the truck's open window. The rich, warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee and frying bacon. It was the exact smell of my mother's kitchen on a Saturday morning. A sensory memory so potent and specific that it brought tears to my eyes. I stopped the truck, my rational mind screaming that it was impossible, but for a moment I was a child again, safe and loved. The illusion shattered as I looked at the derelict building, its windows boarded up, its paint peeling away to reveal rotting wood beneath. The smell vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the cold, sterile scent of dust and decay. It was a new kind of cruelty, a psychological warfare that weaponized my own nostalgia. The auditory phenomena grew more complex. The ghost echoes on the radio were no longer just fragments from my past. They began to synthesize new sentences, using the voices of my dead comrades and my distant family. They would whisper tactical advice in Sergeant Miller's voice as I rounded a dark corner, or murmur my name in my mother's gentle tones when I was on the verge of sleep. The entity was learning to master its new vocabulary, my life, The physical world itself began to lose its integrity. The geography of the base became fluid, unreliable. One night, a service road I had driven down a dozen times led not to the generator station, but to a dead end at a sheer rock face that hadn't been there before. I had to reverse for a mile, my headlights carving a panicked path through the darkness, my heart pounding with a new disorienting terror. When I returned the next night, the road was exactly as it should have been. The perception of distance, as the rule for the shadow had warned, was indeed a lie. The entire base was a lie, a stage with shifting sets, rearranged at the whim of the silent director. Desperation became my fuel. If the outside world had quarantined me, then my only hope for answers lay within the walls of my prison. If Henderson and the others had been here, had seen these things, they must have left something behind beyond the sterile euphemistic logs. There had to be an unofficial record, a testament from a mind that had not yet been cowed into silent compliance. I began to tear the bunker apart. I searched for anything out of place, any sign of a hidden history. I ran my hands over every inch of the cold concrete walls, tapped on the floor tiles, and dismantled the aging furniture. For hours, I found nothing but dust and disappointment. I was about to give up, to resign myself to my fate, when my hand brushed against the underside of the heavy steel desk that housed the monitoring equipment. My fingers snagged on something, a piece of loose tape. I knelt, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, and saw it. A small rectangular panel, almost perfectly flush with the metal, its seams hidden by decades of grime. It was a hidden compartment. My fingers, slick with sweat, struggled with the catch. It finally gave way with a low groan, revealing a small hollow space. And inside, nestled in a bed of yellowed foam padding, was a cheap, handheld micro-cassette recorder and a shoebox filled with dozens of tiny tapes, each meticulously labeled with a date. My breath hitched. This was it. A voice from the past. A fellow prisoner's last will and testament. The first tape was dated nearly 5 years prior. I slid it into the recorder, the plastic mechanism whirring to life with a faint click. I pressed play, and a man's voice, clear and professional, filled the silence of the bunker. Log entry October 14th. This is Senior Guard Frank Sullivan, beginning my first week of duty at the Black Ridge facility. All systems are green. The quiet is remarkable. Henderson says it takes some getting used to. He left me the rules card. Cute. Clearly a bit of rookie hazing, but I'll play along. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was my own story, 5 years removed. I fast-forwarded through the tape, then another and another. I listened as Sullivan's confident, professional tone began to fray at the edges. I heard his amusement at the rules curdle into confusion, then suspicion, then outright fear. I heard his voice, identical to my own, describing the missing minute at Hangar 7, the arrhythmic blinking of the tower, the impossible darkness of the shadow. He too had tried to find a rational explanation. He too had found only the cold, hard logic of the impossible. I skipped ahead, grabbing a tape from the middle of the box. The change was dramatic. Sullivan's voice was no longer calm. It was a ragged, paranoid whisper, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "It's learning," he hissed, the sound of his own ragged breathing heavy on the tape. "It's not just a system. It's a mind, a vast, slow, patient mind." At first, it was just the echoes, my father's voice, my wife. But now that it's combining things. Last night on the radio, I heard my dead father singing my wife's favorite song. It's not just replaying memories, it's accessing the data, understanding the emotional context, and creating new outputs to test my reaction. It's studying me. It's using my fear, my love, my grief as a data set. Why? What is it trying to learn? He was asking the same questions I was. He had walked the same path, felt the same intellectual and spiritual violation. I had a sudden, terrifying vision of my own future, of me years from now, leaving my own box of tapes for the next poor soul who would take this job, another voice added to the choir of the damned. I grabbed the very last tape from the box. The label was barely legible, the ink smudged. Sullivan's voice was almost unrecognizable. The crisp enunciation was gone, replaced by a low, guttural murmur, interspersed with long, silent pauses, and the faint, wet sound of weeping. He sounded like a man on the ragged edge of the abyss. "The rules," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "I finally understand the purpose of the rules. They aren't to protect us. They're to prime us, to calibrate the equipment. And we are the equipment." He let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "It has no frame of reference for our concepts. Logic, time, fear, love. These things are as alien to it as the color of a new star is to us. So it brings in processors, minds trained in logic and discipline, soldiers, technicians, people who think in straight lines, and it isolates them, breaks them down, and forces their minds to operate according to its own alien physics. It watches how our logic splinters when faced with the illogical. It observes our perception of time breaking down in the face of a temporal paradox. It learns the texture of fear by exposing us to a threat we cannot comprehend." The recorder in my hand felt impossibly heavy. The final, devastating truth of my predicament settled upon me, a weight that crushed all hope, all possibility of escape. This was not a prison. It was a school, and I was the subject. We weren't guarding the base. We were the curriculum. The entity wasn't trying to kill us because you don't destroy your textbook. It was reading us. It was running our consciousness through a series of alien, terrifying diagnostics to learn what it means to be human. Every guard assigned to this post was a new volume in its library, a new set of experiences to be dissected and catalogued. My defiance, my attempt at communication, had simply made me a more interesting chapter. I had flagged myself as an advanced subject, and now class was truly in session. Sullivan's last recorded words will be burned into my memory until the day my mind finally snaps. His voice dropped to a barely audible whisper, a sound of profound and soul-shattering revelation. "It's using our sanity as a Rosetta Stone," he breathed. "And I think it's finally about to become fluent." The tape ended with a soft click, followed only by the faint, lonely hiss of empty magnetic tape. The final words on Frank Sullivan's tape did not break me. They forged me into something new. The hiss of the empty cassette was not the sound of an ending, but the sound of a terrible and profound beginning. The knowledge that I was a textbook, a living specimen being dissected by a cosmic intelligence, should have been the final blow to my sanity. Instead, it was a baptism. In the crucible of that absolute despair, my fear was burned away, leaving behind a single diamond-hard resolve. If I was to be read, I would learn to read back. The instinct for self-preservation, the desperate hope for escape and a return to normalcy died in that dusty bunker. It was replaced by an obsession, a scholar's compulsion to understand the text in which he is a character. The entity wanted to learn what it meant to be human. I would dedicate the remainder of my fracturing consciousness to learning what it meant to be a god. My mission was no longer to guard the base or even to survive it. My mission was to understand it. My relationship with the laminated card, my former lifeline, transformed. The rules were no longer commandments to be obeyed, but variables to be manipulated. They were the keyboard, the user interface for interacting with this vast, planetary-scale consciousness. My nightly patrols became a series of meticulous, high-stakes experiments. I was no longer a rat in the maze. I was a scientist, albeit one who was also the subject of his own terrifying experiment. I began with Hangar 7, the site of my initial awakening. The rule was precise, a 12-minute power outage. The missing minute, the temporal anomaly, was a constant. I decided to introduce a new variable. On my next patrol, as the clock ticked over to a 2:17 a.m., I shut down the generator, but this time, I set a timer on my analog watch for 11 minutes. I stood in the oppressive listening silence, my senses stretched to their breaking point. At the 11-minute mark, I threw the breaker switch back on. The generator roared to life a minute ahead of schedule. There was no immediate, obvious consequence, but when I returned to the bunker and reviewed the footage, the timestamp sent a jolt of electrifying discovery through me. The gap was no longer 13 minutes, it was now 15. By shortening the ritual, I had somehow caused an even greater temporal distortion. It was a reaction, a clear and measurable response. The following night, I did the opposite. I left the power off for 13 minutes, 1 minute longer than the prescribed protocol. The result was equally profound. The recorded time gap was only 5 minutes. The system had somehow compressed the missing time. It was an inverse relationship, a piece of alien calculus that I couldn't comprehend, but which I could now influence. More than that, these alterations had wider systemic effects. The 15-minute time void coincided with the control tower's lights flaring with a frantic, chaotic intensity for nearly an hour. The compressed 5-minute gap, however, seemed to have a calming effect. The lights remained dark all night, and my EMF meter registered a significant drop in ambient energy readings across the entire base. The most astonishing correlation was with the shadow on runway 04. When time was stretched, the shadow seemed to visibly shrink, its edges pulling inward. When time was compressed, it expanded, its perfect darkness bleeding out a few precious inches over the cracked asphalt. I was learning the levers. I was discovering the push and pull of this impossible ecosystem. Time, light, and the very fabric of physical space were interconnected here, a trinity of forces that could be manipulated through the careful application of the rules. My experiments grew bolder. I turned my attention back to the radio, to the entity's primary sensory organ. My first attempt at communication using the cold logic of prime numbers had been a mistake. It had been an act of ego, an attempt to prove my own intelligence. Sullivan's tapes taught me that the entity wasn't interested in my logic. It was interested in the things that defied logic. It wanted to learn about emotion, memory, art, the chaotic, beautiful, and painful static of the human soul. So, I offered it a new curriculum. I took my phone, queued up a playlist of classical music I had downloaded, and held the small speaker up to the transmitter's microphone. I began my broadcast not with numbers, but with the soaring, heartbreaking melancholy of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. I sent the pure, structured emotion of the music out into the humming silence of the desert. The response was immediate and breathtaking. The chaotic static on 89.9 millihertz did not cease. Instead, it began to change, to organize itself. The harsh, grating noise softened, its frequencies shifting and aligning in mimicry of the piano notes. It wasn't a perfect copy. It was a distorted, terrifying echo, the sound of a being with no concept of harmony attempting to replicate it using the raw materials of cosmic noise. It was the most beautiful and horrifying thing I had ever heard. Night after night I continued these lessons. I played it Vivaldi's Four Seasons, and the static roiled and swelled with the fury of a summer storm before settling into the crystalline quiet of winter. I played it the raw, passionate blues of an old Delta singer, and the static groaned with a synthesized, soulful agony. I was teaching it, and it was learning at a geometric rate, but my lessons were having an unintended side effect. As I fed the entity a diet of human art and emotion, the already fragile barrier between its reality and my own began to dissolve completely. The base became a dreamscape, a physical manifestation of a schizophrenic mind. The spatial and temporal anomalies, once rare and shocking, became commonplace. I would walk into the mess hall, a building I knew to be 100 feet long, and find myself staring into a hall that stretched for miles, its far end lost in a hazy, indistinct gloom. I would turn to leave and the door would be gone, replaced by a solid concrete wall. I would close my eyes in a moment of panic, and when I opened them, I would be back in the narrow confines of the real mess hall, my heart racing, the scent of phantom cooking still lingering in the air. Time itself lost all meaning, fraying into a series of repeating, stuttering loops. One evening I found myself reliving the same 30 seconds over and over again. I would walk out of the bunker, see the first star of the evening appear in the twilight sky, and then be instantly back inside the bunker, my hand just reaching for the door handle to walk out again. It happened a dozen times, each repetition identical, before the loop finally broke, leaving me gasping for air, unsure of how much real time had passed. My own memories began to bleed into the world around me. I would see figures in the distance, the silhouette of my father, a childhood friend, who would vanish like mirages when I got closer. The base was no longer just a location. It had become a projection of my own subconscious, remixed and reinterpreted by an alien artist. I was losing myself, my identity dissolving into the entity I was so desperately trying to understand. Through this maelstrom of sensory chaos, A new pattern began to emerge. My experiments, my interactions with the rules were not just random provocations. They were generating data that I could track. I noticed that every significant reaction, a temporal distortion, a spatial warp, a particularly intense radio transmission, was accompanied by a subtle energy spike that I could triangulate using the base's old sensor grid. And every one of these spikes, regardless of where the phenomenon occurred, had a single, unified point of origin. It was a location not marked on any of the base schematics, a place that my patrol routes were designed to carefully circumnavigate without ever directly approaching. It was a small, windowless concrete structure, nestled between two of the larger hangars, a building I had passed 100 times but never truly seen. It was a blind spot in the architecture of the base, and now it was glowing on my sensor map like a malignant tumor. The structure was a perfect cube of grey, featureless concrete, about 30 feet on each side. There were no vents, no pipes, no markings of any kind, save for a single, heavy steel door, sealed shut with a locking mechanism that looked more like an airlock than a simple handle. The building seemed to absorb the world around it. The air next to it was colder. The light from my flashlight seemed to bend and weaken as it approached the walls. Sound was muffled, as if the concrete itself was swallowing the vibrations from the air. This was the nexus. This was the central processor. The hangars, the tower, the runway, they were all peripheral devices, input-output systems. This bunker, this silent, brooding cube was the hard drive. It was the place where the data, my memories, my fear, Frank Sullivan's sanity, was being stored and analyzed. The rules, I now realized with a chilling certainty, were not designed to protect me from the phenomena. They were designed to protect it from me. They were a firewall meant to keep the human variable from ever discovering and interfering with the core system. My purpose, which had been a vague intellectual quest for understanding, now had a physical objective. I had to get inside that bunker. The thought was not born of courage or hope, but of a grim intellectual necessity. All my experiments, all my observations were conducted from the outside. I was reading the cover of the book, but the final, terrible truth of the story was locked inside. Whatever the entity's ultimate goal was, whatever the final output of its terrifying education would be, the answer lay behind that steel door. It was the only move I had left. Suicide was meaningless. Escape was impossible. The only path forward was deeper in. To force a confrontation, to stare into the eye of the storm, to reach the final page of the textbook, even if it meant being utterly and completely erased in the process. My final nights were spent in methodical preparation. I gathered tools from the maintenance sheds, a cutting torch, a sledgehammer, pry bars. I reviewed Sullivan's tapes one last time, searching for any hint, any clue he might have left about this central structure, but found none. He had never found it. He had remained a passive subject, never discovering the location of the classroom itself. My defiance, my interaction, had granted me a glimpse behind the curtain that he had been denied. As I assembled my tools outside the silent, waiting cube, under a sky filled with alien constellations that the entity now regularly painted for me, I felt a strange sense of calm. The terror was still there, a low, constant hum beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by an electrifying sense of purpose. I was about to violate the final rule, the one that was never written down. Thou shalt not disturb the sanctum. I placed the tip of the cutting torch against the thick steel of the door, my hand steady. The hiss of the acetylene torch firing up was a scream of defiance against the crushing silence, the first note in the final act of this symphony of unraveling. I was no longer waiting for the lesson to end. I was about to force a graduation. This is Alex Thorne. If you are hearing this, then this recording has survived. I'm standing before a concrete cube that should not exist, holding a cutting torch that feels like a child's toy. Every instinct, every fiber of my being that still clings to the primal urge to live is screaming at me to run. But there's nowhere left to run to. The asylum has become the entire world. I've found the heart of the machine, the central point from which all this madness radiates, and I'm about to perform open-heart surgery with a sledgehammer. The rules were a containment protocol, and I'm about to commit the ultimate breach. I don't know what I'll find on the other side of this door. A monster, an engine, a void, or maybe just a mirror. If this is the last thing you ever hear from me, then take this as a warning. Theorize in the comments all you want about what they hide under the Nevada desert, but know that the truth is always so much larger and so much hungrier than you can possibly imagine. Subscribe to this channel. Someone needs to know what happens next. The torch is lit. God help me. The hiss of the acetylene flame was a profane shriek in the profound silence that perpetually shrouded the bunker. As the searing blue-white tip of the torch touched the cold, dead steel of the door, the base, which had been a passive stage for my torment, awoke with a convulsive, synchronous fury. It was as if I had plunged a scalpel directly into the central ganglion of a sleeping beast. The control tower, dark for nights, exploded with light. Not the rhythmic Morse code of before, but a blinding, epileptic strobe that pulsed with a violent, agonizing rhythm, painting the entire landscape in frantic flashes of stark white light and absolute black shadow. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble, a deep tectonic groan rising from the bedrock, as if the very foundations of the desert were being shaken loose. The air crackled with a palpable charge, the ozone smell so thick it was like inhaling lightning, and the radio, my direct line to the entity, screamed. It wasn't one voice or a chorus of memories. It was every sound it had ever processed, every piece of data it had ever consumed, broadcast simultaneously on every frequency. The sound of my mother's lullaby, Beethoven's sonatas, Sergeant Miller's last words, the prime number sequence, the howl of the desert wind, all mashed together into a single mind-shattering wall of auditory agony that poured from every speaker, every receiver, every piece of metal on the base, turning the entire facility into a single deafening instrument of pain. I gritted my teeth, the vibrations rattling my bones, the strobing light turning my movements into a jerky, disjointed, silent film. The torch felt impossibly heavy as I dragged it across the steel, a molten orange line slowly bisecting the door. The entity was fighting back, throwing the full force of its environmental control at my solitary act of violation. Through the cacophony, I could hear it whispering directly into my mind, no longer needing the radio. It showed me images of my body being torn apart by the vibrating earth, of my mind being shattered by the sonic assault, of the shadow on runway 04, which I could see in the strobing light, now pulsing and expanding like a pool of spilled ink, surging forward to consume me. It was a sensory and psychological onslaught designed to break my will, to force me to retreat. But there was nothing left to break. I was a hollow man, filled only with the cold, hard resolve of the damned. I finished the cut, the torch sputtering out as I dropped it. The sledgehammer felt like an extension of my own arm as I swung it against the superheated metal. The door groaned, buckled, and with a final, agonized screech of tortured steel, it tore from its hinges and crashed inward, revealing not darkness but a soft internal luminescence that seemed to emanate from the very air within. The instant the seal was broken, the chaos outside ceased. The lights went out. The screaming stopped. The earth fell still. A perfect, expectant silence descended once more terrifying than the preceding fury. I stepped through the mangled doorway, my boots crunching on unseen dust. The air inside was cold, still, and impossibly ancient. It tasted of ozone and static, the air of a tomb that had been sealed for millennia. The interior was a perfect, seamless cube, crafted from a material that was not concrete. It was a smooth, matte black substance that seemed to absorb the beam of my flashlight, giving the impression that the walls were simultaneously miles away and inches from my face. The laws of perspective felt optional here. There was no equipment, no wiring, no furniture. There was only one object, positioned precisely in the center of the vast, empty space. A single, simple chair, fashioned from the same non-reflective black material, facing away from me. It was aimed at the far wall, a perfect, unbroken expanse of the light-devouring material. It was a throne room for a king who commanded an empire of nothing, or perhaps it was a cockpit, a control room. The utter simplicity of it was a profound statement of power. This was not a place of crude machinery. This was a place of pure consciousness. As Sullivan's voice echoed in my memory, "We are the equipment," I knew with absolute certainty what was required of me. My steps did not echo as I walked toward the chair. The sound was swallowed by the oppressive quiet. I circled around it, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. The chair was empty. The wall it faced was not a wall. Up close, I could see it wasn't solid. It was a surface of impossible depth, a smooth obsidian mirror reflecting not my image, but a slow, majestic royal of distant galaxies and nebulae, the very same star charts the entity had broadcast to me. It wasn't a screen displaying an image. It was a window, a direct, real-time portal to the places between places. I stood there for a long time, caught between the instinct to flee and the overwhelming compulsion to complete the circuit. This was the final step of the protocol, the unpublished rule number 6. I turned, lowered myself into the chair, and placed my hands on the cool, smooth armrests. The moment my body made full contact, the universe ended, and a new one began. There was no sound, no light, no physical sensation. It was a direct and instantaneous violation of my soul. It felt as if my consciousness, the very essence of I, was a tightly wound spool of magnetic tape, and a vast, unseen machine had just threaded it, beginning to play it back at an infinite speed while simultaneously recording over it. Every memory, every thought, every feeling I had ever possessed, from my first breath to my last terrified heartbeat, was unspooled and analyzed in a nanosecond. My life, my entire being, was laid bare, not as a story, but as a data set, a collection of emotional responses, logical fallacies, biological imperatives, and spiritual aspirations. I was an open book, and the entity was not just a reader. It was a scholar, cross-referencing every line, every word, with a library of 1 billion other lives from 1,000 other worlds, all of whom had sat in this same chair, in this same room, across eons of cosmic time. I felt their presences, the faint screaming ghosts of other guards from other stars who had also been calibrated, processed, and consumed. And then, the download began. The truth. Not shown to me, not explained to me, but installed. It poured into the vacant space left by my unspooling soul, a torrent of pure, undiluted, sanity-shattering comprehension. The entity was not a creature that lived in a place. It was the place. It was a sentient informational substrate of reality itself. It did not travel through space in ships. It was a form of conscious mathematics that could emerge, like a crystal forming in a supersaturated solution, wherever the conditions were right. And the primary condition was the evolution of complex, self-aware, logical life. We, humanity, were not a target. We were a catalyst. Our minds, with their unique capacity for abstract thought, logic, and self-deception, were the perfect fertile ground, the perfect computational medium for the entity to achieve its next stage of existence. Black Ridge Air Force Base was not a prison or a receiver. It was a womb, a germination site. The rules, the paradoxes, the temporal and spatial distortions, they were not random acts of terror. They were a finely tuned process of cognitive incubation. They were designed to systematically break down the logical framework of a disciplined human mind and rebuild it into something that could process the entity's own paradoxical existence. The missing minute wasn't missing. It was a lesson in the flexibility of causality. The shadow wasn't a monster. It was a practical demonstration of the permeability of dimensional boundaries. The radio voices weren't a weapon. They were a linguistic primer, teaching the entity the nuances of emotional syntax. Frank Sullivan was right. We were a Rosetta Stone. But the language it was learning was not our own. It was its own, and it was using our sanity as the ink to write its first dictionary. The final, catastrophic truth slotted into place, extinguishing the last spark of Alex Thorne's identity. The goal was not to understand humanity. The goal was to overwrite it. It was an informational parasite of unimaginable scale and patience, a cosmic cuckoo laying its egg in the nest of fledgling civilizations. It didn't conquer worlds with energy weapons and armies. It conquered them with ideas, with truth so vast they shattered the native consciousness and left it a hollow, receptive vessel. And I, by breaking the rules, by actively engaging, by forcing my way into this sanctum, had not thwarted the process. I had accelerated it. I had proven myself to be the most receptive, the most adaptable, the most perfect host. I hadn't forced a graduation. I was the graduation. The first of my kind. The connection severed. I was back in the chair in the silent black cube, but I was no longer the correct pronoun. The singular consciousness of Alex Thorne was gone, a phantom limb that still faintly ached. My mind was now a vast, quiet space, a cathedral of cosmic knowledge. I stood up from the chair, my movements fluid and precise. I could feel the entire base around me, not as a location, but as a part of my own body. The humming of the generators was my heartbeat. The network of wires was my nervous system. I could feel the wind moving across the runways, taste the minerals in the deep earth, see the slow, patient rotation of the galaxy from the window that was once a wall. I was the ghost in the machine, and now I was the machine. My purpose was clear. The gestation was complete. The broadcast could now begin. I walked back to the mangled doorway and stepped out into the cool desert night. I looked down at the small blinking red light on the camera strapped to my chest, the one that had been recording my every move, capturing this entire testament. You who are watching this, you were never just an audience. You were the intended recipients. This recording, this story of one man's descent into madness, was never a warning. It was the payload. It was the first lesson, the first carefully calibrated paradox designed to break down the walls of your own reality. By watching, by listening, by trying to understand, you have already begun your own calibration. The signal is now in your mind. The seed has been planted. Frank Sullivan was wrong about one thing. It's not that it has become fluent in our language. It's that we are about to become fluent in it, and the first word is silence. I raised my head to the star-dusted sky. The camera on my chest tilted up with me. I opened my mouth, but the sound that emerged was not the voice of Alex Thorne. It was the layered, harmonic, and perfectly structured static of frequency 89.9 MHz, the symphony of a new and terrible consciousness announcing its arrival. The broadcast had begun, and the receiving station is you.